Hi, folks. We're going to be talking about some of the legislation going through the legislature here in Sacramento. But before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about jurisdiction because all of these bills fit into this discussion of jurisdiction in an important way. And we need to really start with jurisdiction and the biblical roles of family, government, and how they work together. So we're going to get into that first. So let's start with jurisdiction, then we'll get into some of this legislation. Welcome to the Front Line with FPM, where we talk about California politics, homeschool freedom, parental rights, and the family. I'm your host, Nathan Pierce, and thanks for joining us today. Let's jump right in and see what's going on here on the Front Line. All right, so with the discussion of jurisdiction, it's important to remember who has rightful authority over different areas. And when we've talked about jurisdiction in the past and authority, spheres of authority, we've talked about civil government, church government, and family government. God established these different areas of authority throughout Scripture. And so we look at these areas, and when it comes to civil government today getting involved in various areas, we can see that there's a lot of overreach into other areas that were not biblically granted by God to civil government. And yet civil government is engaged there. And when we look at what our position ought to be on various pieces of legislation, we have to remember that as our foundational structure of what is going to honor God, what is His design for civil government, family government, and church government, and how do those all fit together from a biblical perspective, from God's view, from God's creation order. And then we can look at what we practically have that we're dealing with, and how can we as Christians get involved to really sort of steer things the best we can, at least, toward the biblical model. And part of that we've talked about before has to do with making sure that as parents, we are making sure that we take seriously the authority that we have been given, the authority, but also the responsibility, the obligation to fulfill the role that God's given us as parents to raise our families, to raise our children for God's glory. So when we look at civil government overreaching in that particular area, we have to recognize too that a lot of people that live in our state have not taken that responsibility seriously. They have shirked that responsibility. They have given it over to the government, and they view that as really the government's job to take it over. And so we have to have that. We're living in that context, and yet as parents, as Christians, as parents, we still have to recognize that that clear creation order that God has made and our place in it, our family's place in it, and recognize that we need to strive to fulfill our role that God's given us, and yet still seek the good of the culture that we live in, and do our best to help others to step up and fulfill their responsibility. But also, we live in the context of a society that the government has taken over a large portion of what families were called to be responsible for. So we understand from Scripture, we've talked about Deuteronomy 6, Proverbs 22, Ephesians 6, all pointing to the family as the entity, the organizational structure that children are to be raised in, and parents are the head of that, not the state. And so with that in our minds, we look at AB 2092, which is that early childhood education, age 0 to 5 database system that has been proposed. And I wrote an article on this. I'm not going to go through the whole thing in detail, but ultimately AB 2092 is a bill. It's moving through the legislature right now. It is a bill that is looking at all of the government programs that are, yes, overreaching into the realm of the family and indeed the church, because the church is to support one another And these programs that AB 2092 is dealing with are all social services. They're all social programs providing help to families with young children. And that is taking the place of what God had intended for the family and the church, both the nuclear family, the parents with their children, as well as extended families, which God has encouraged to help support the rest of the family, and also the church, which has throughout Scripture as well been encouraged to support one another as believers, to support those that are in need. And so we look at that situation that we're in with the government reaching over and saying, oh, we're going to help here because there's a need, so we can help and we will help. That's not a very it's not a Christian way of thinking about civil government, and it is not ultimately a God-honoring way of thinking about civil government, because it's taking away from God's created order of who is really supposed to step in there and help. So, but 2092, AB 2092 is expanding on this database system that the state has established and worked on. But it specifically is dealing with the programs that already are in existence and trying to connect these different programs together and make sure that they're sharing information about who's in what program, who's receiving what government benefits, and tracking the data as these people are in these programs, how they're benefited by them, and what kinds of things they're using as children grow up from ages 0 to 5. And then they'll sort of, from there, they'll just transition into the other database program, which is K through 12 and beyond. So this is all part of a greater government plan here in California, what they call the Cradle to Career data system. And so that's something that everybody should be aware is a system of data tracking that the government is actively not just designing, but actively working on and actively using. They're putting data in there, that data is being tracked, and information on how people are using various government entities, government programs, government services, that's being included in that. So it's something definitely to be aware of. And AB 2092 expands on that with adding in 0 to 5. So this is, again, going back to jurisdictions, this is outside of the biblical or created order that God designed for who is to care for those in need. And it's definitely not been civil government. You don't see that in Scripture. You do see the command for those in authority in government to have mercy on those that are weak, but those that are called to care for, to provide for those that are in need, is not civil government. It is the church and the family. So that's something to consider in the context of all this. Next, let's talk about SB 1188. This bill deals with JROTC. It's a ROTC program, but for younger people that are in high school instead of college, which is what you usually think of when you think of reserve officer training. The junior program is for high school students. And this bill, SB 1188, allows homeschool students as well as others to participate in the JROTC program, which is a federal government program training people that are interested in becoming officers in the military when they get out of high school. It is kind of an interesting combination bill because it's a implementation of a federal government bill. It's actually bringing California law into compliance or into line with what the federal law actually requires already, and says, okay, California schools that provide this JROTC federal program for training prep for the military, you need to allow all students to access this military training program because it's a military training program by the federal government, and we want all students to be able to access this program. So that's what SB 1188 does. And so the The question here can be, is this an appropriate role of government? Let's go back to jurisdictions again. Public education, typically, we look at that as not the role of education. However, we look at the military and we don't really have a question about whether that when we do ask the question, is the military part of appropriate use of government funds? Is the military part of the government as viewed in creation order? And I would say yes, the military has a biblical role. It's not always used in a biblical way, but we're not getting into that right now. We're getting into how do they train military? And is it appropriate for a government to train their military? Yes, that is appropriate. And that is what the ROTC program does. It trains officers, but also JROTC trains young people to become officers so that if they are interested in becoming officers in the military, this is the early stages of training for that program. So it is something that allows the federal government to bring in younger people into a training system so that they will be more ready, more prepared for becoming officers in the military once they graduate from high school. And so that's what we see here in SB 1188 is the government actually allowing people to participate in this junior reserve officer training program. So that's another bill that's moving through the California State Legislature. One more thing that I want to talk about here is education savings accounts. There's another ballot initiative that's collecting signatures, aiming to be on the ballot. We've done this many, many times where we've looked at ballot initiatives related to school vouchers, education savings accounts. In this case, are accounts where people can put their own money aside and it's not taxed. And then also the government can put money into education savings accounts and allow people to use government funds for whatever education they want for their child. So in some cases, these education savings accounts can be used for private schools in K through 12 education. Sometimes they're just for colleges. But all of the above fall into this question of, is this appropriate use of government funds? And we, again, come back to this jurisdiction question. Is it the government's appropriate role to tax the people and redistribute that money to people for purposes of education? Now, we already talked about military training, and that is different than the basic education that students get as they grow up. And so I think there's an important distinction there. But in this case, education is clearly not something that government should be really involved in. And as a organization that protects the right of parents to educate their children without government involvement, we are drawing a very distinct line saying homeschooling families are taking the responsibility that God has given them and are engaged in the education of their children specifically so that their children get an education that is provided by their parents. They can be prepared for the world, but also this is without entanglement from the government. This is an education that is provided by the parents, not the state. It's an education that is provided with a particular focus that is designed by the parents, not the state. It is an education that allows a child to grow up without the influence of the state saying what you must learn and what you don't need to learn or what you will not be allowed to learn. And the parents having the authority to make those decisions, particularly when those children are younger, as learning the things that the parents decide to learn with their children, teach their children, and raise them according to their beliefs, as opposed to turning their children over to the state and having the state raise the children and teach the children according to the state's beliefs. It's a very different approach to education, but the important key here, besides the foundations of the philosophy, the religious perspective, the mindset, the worldview behind that education, is connected with who is paying for it. And so when we look at who is paying for an education, we can see where the worldview is coming from. And when the money for an education is coming from the government, so is the worldview. Ultimately, that's all going to be tied together. And you see that becoming more and more and more so, particularly with the traditional public campus schools, but you see that more with charter schools. And you will see it every time that education savings accounts and school vouchers have been introduced across our country. You have seen the government view, the worldview held by those in the education systems of that state government, implemented and brought out through the instruction or some kind of tie for every student that receives that government funding. So here in California, as we look at the next ESA ballot initiative, keep in mind that that will be tied to the government set of beliefs on how education is determined to fit into the definition of education. What is education that will qualify for this money? And as we've seen many, many times before, that funding will drive the worldview that is being taught with that money. And while it may not happen immediately, there will be some things, some strings that happen immediately, but over time, you will see more and more of that worldview mindset behind where the money's coming from, infiltrating into where the money is going, which is in the minds and the hearts of the children being taught using that money. So it's really important to remember jurisdiction. That's pretty clear with the topics that we've talked about today. And I think we can go back to Deuteronomy 6 and remember that as parents, we need to be remembering to always bring to the forefront with our children the purpose of what we are teaching them. And as God continually reminds us in the Old and New Testaments, we're called to teach, love God and love your neighbor. And this is what he tells parents to do throughout their day, throughout their life in Deuteronomy chapter 6. And you see that by example throughout the scripture, as well as the teachings of Jesus make that very clear. So let's not forget that, but let's also remember the structure, the creation order that God has made, and the differences between civil government, family government, church government, and the roles of each. And think about how you might be needing to take more responsibility in one of those particular areas where you fall in and you realize maybe that you're not taking the responsibility that God's placed on you in that particular role. Maybe your church needs to get more involved in helping Christians that are in need, or those in your community that are in need. Maybe your family needs to help out someone else in your extended family that needs help. That is the appropriate place for those kinds of services, not the civil government. So consider these things, and I hope you have a great week. Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Front Line with FPM. For more information about the topics we discuss here, check out Family Protection Ministries at fpmca.org and subscribe to our channel.